I'm your host, Carolyn Solo, LCSW, EMDR therapist, and mom of 3 daughters. Thank you for joining me. Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 28 of the Future Template Parent podcast. Thank you all for all of you who continue to listen and download episodes. That's really exciting, and I'm so glad that this podcast is resonating with people, and I hope that you all are learning and gaining insights from my own experience and what I'm sharing with you. So today on episode 28, I am going to talk about interweaves. And I've decided after writing my notes for this episode that this is going to be a two-parter. I thought it was going to be a single episode, but there's just so much to cram in that I think I'm going to add some more thoughts next week. So I found interweaves always to be fascinating, and I'm going to talk some about what an interweave is and my own process in starting to understand how to use them more effectively, some of my own misconceptions and fears about interweaves at the beginning of my EMDR journey, and I'll talk about one of my favorite and most used interweaves. And like I said, in next week's episode, I'm going to continue this conversation, probably talk some more about other interweaves I like to use and any other interweave revelations I come up with during the week. So, first of all, what even is an interweave? I know we all technically learn this in basic training, but I think often there's this mystery that surrounds interweaves. And officially, they're called cognitive interweaves. And Francine Shapiro first developed this idea of cognitive interweaves as a way to deal with complex cases. That's what she says in the EMDR book, the first major tome that was written on EMDR, the one that we all read for basic training, or we're told to read. Whether or not we read it is another story. I did read it, but I know many people did not. It's a big, hefty book. But in any case, interweaves are a way to deal with complex cases, says Francine Shapiro. And this implies that non-complex cases, whatever those are, do not require interweaves. That, quote, trusting the process is sufficient, and people will process their traumatic memories and make process without a single interweave. And that we should never intervene and make the mistake of stopping the client's processing, stopping the natural movement of a client's nervous system. And I certainly agree that it's really important for us to stay out of the way, not say too much, not, sort of trample all over where the client is going on their own. But I also know that many of us come to basic training having spent a lot of time working in other modalities, and often we're used to talking more, right? We're used to, for better or for worse, having a pretty active role in the therapy room. And I think we still do in EMDR, but I think it looks different. And that when we first learn EMDR, we learn a protocol, right? We learn standard protocol. And it can feel a bit rigid, kind of artificial, maybe constraining. Maybe we're not really on board with, how it actually works when we first train in it. I know that I had that experience. Maybe we're used to more of a flow, more of like a natural pace of conversation that isn't overly structured. And EMDR can feel really prescriptive, I guess. Prescriptive. You know what I mean? And constraining at first. And as you probably know, if you've listened to my podcast, I don't feel that way now, that EMDR is prescriptive and constraining, but I certainly did at the beginning. I'm trained in the psychodynamic, orientation and tradition, and I will always see myself as a psychodynamically oriented, attachment-focused, and relational therapist. And I bring all of that to my identity as an EMDR therapist. I don't know why I just said that weirdly. EMDR therapist. I don't think I've ever said that before. My holiday overwhelmed brain is, a little overloaded right now. And I still and always will, I hesitate to say always, but I think I feel very grounded in my identity as an EMDR therapist, first now, but that my psychodynamic and attachment-based orientation will always be a part of who I am as a therapist and influence how I do EMDR, right? So in any case, because of my previous orientation, I was used to talking in therapy sessions. I was used to talking a lot. I was used to talking too much, really. As you can, those of you who have listened to the podcast know, I am a talker. I can talk and talk and talk, right? So the challenge to, quote, stay out of the way in EMDR with the protocol was unsettling, but was really good for me, right? It sort of forced me to learn how to give clients more space than maybe I had been able to do in the past, and maybe I should have been doing all along. Still, I felt a lot of discomfort, right? I felt like, what was I actually even doing if I was just sitting there running the light bar and saying, what are you noticing, right? Of course, I know that that's not the case now that I am doing a lot and that my conceptualization and my skills and my knowledge about EMDR are always operating. But I just wanted to name this in case this is something you've experienced yourself. Not to mention that we didn't even learn about interweaves until the second weekend of my EMDR basic training. And however your basic training was structured, in general, I know interweaves come later in the training. So I didn't even know that there was a possibility of, quote, doing more when I was sent off to practice EMDR for 2 months. Or I forget. I think that was how long it was between my two weekends. But when I finally heard about interweaves, I was so excited. I was like, yay, I finally get to share some of my amazing insights that I've been holding on to. Obviously that's not what an interweave is or how it should be used, but I did feel excitement and relief when I learned about interweaves, that there was more to my role than just sitting back, not, but that I had a more active role to take. I would be doing something that felt a little more familiar, something that could relieve some of my anxiety about this new modality because I would be doing something that felt more familiar. So learning how to use interweaves effectively, not to overdo it, not to underdo it, how to choose an interweave that will be effective right there. That's the art of the interweave, right? I am not someone who now believes that you should always stay out of the way and say nothing. That if you do more than that, you're getting in the way and you're unduly influencing or, slowing the processing. I think that when Shapiro says that, what she's trying to indicate is that we can all have the tendency to do too much, and that it's so important to respect the client's nervous system and innate healing capacity. That's such a big part of the AIP model and the sort of way we think about EMDR in general, and one of the reasons why it can differ from other modalities. So that staying out of the way is essential, and allowing their nervous systems to be the primary agents of change. A lot of us struggle to do that. That's not how we were trained. And that often comes from our own desire to feel helpful, to feel useful in a profession that can be pretty nebulous, where we don't often see the final, whatever that means, results of the work that we've done. We can often wonder about how we are doing what we're doing, if we're being effective. So she's cautioning against those tendencies as we're learning this new and different approach. So I do think staying out of the way is really important. And as I said, because I'm a talker, it's been a really good practice for me to have to stay out of the way, to cultivate that practice. And as something that you'll hear me say a lot is that the first thing I do if a client is looping or stuck is say to myself, let's go for 3 more sets. Okay, and then return to target. And that can be a few minutes in there, right? 3 more sets where I'm not saying anything. And then still no movement, go back to target, still no movement. Okay, it's time for an interweave. But that's an important practice for me because I do have this tendency to want to jump in and say something. So knowing that I'm going to do this 3 more sets thing keeps me grounded, and it allows the client's nervous system to do its work. And then, if we're still looping, I will give myself permission to say something, to interweave, to interject. And often during those looping sets, when the client is looping and I'm doing the like just 3 more sets thing, I'll make notes to myself about what I might say, how I might try to move forward, all of my brilliant insights. And that's another way I stay grounded if I'm feeling anxious about that stuckness, and if I'm feeling anxious about, sitting back, I'll kind of make those notes to myself. I promise you, for the most part, most clients are going to be fine waiting 3 more sets. It's a few minutes, right? And it's a few minutes if you're not saying anything, right? Because you're just saying, okay, what did you notice? Okay, great, go with that, right? Like, it's not going to permanently, harm a client usually. And again, if we're talking about severely dissociative clients, a lot of this stuff looks different anyway. But this is a way that I keep myself from jumping in too soon. And I also remind myself that the client doesn't know what I should or shouldn't be doing. They're not like, why isn't she saying anything, right? Like, that's my own anxiety. They're in their process and they trust that I will guide it as necessary. Of course, if a client is having a major ab reaction, a lot of affect, really struggling, if they're starting to dissociate or have a flashback, I'm going to intervene as necessary. I'm not going to be like, just go 3 more sets. But that being said, an ab reaction often is some kind of movement. So in some ways, I don't consider that looping. But if they're kind of frozen, if they're crying a lot, I'm going to intervene. I'm not just going to sit and say, well, I'll wait for 3 more sets and see what happens. So what are interweaves more concretely, beyond Shapiro's definition that they help facilitate movement with complex client cases when processing is stuck? As I've kind of alluded to before, it's pretty unlikely to meet a, quote, simple case, whatever the opposite of a complex case is. I don't think I've ever fully processed a memory with a client without using a single interweave. I just keep waiting for that non-complex case to walk in my door. If you have some, I'd love to, you can refer them to me so I can see what that's like. But yeah, for me, it hasn't really happened yet. So interweaves are necessary. And what makes a case, quote, complex anyway, in my opinion, or complex in the way that maybe Shapiro was thinking of it, it's that there are other earlier attachment experiences and traumatic memories and core beliefs that influence how the current traumatic event is being processed or perceived by a client. So if a client, for example, is, say, processing being fired from their job, and their negative cognition is, it's my fault, or I'm a failure, I'm pretty sure that there are some earlier life experiences that formed those negative cognitions and how they think about this experience. And then, bam, according to Francine Shapiro, that's a complex case. So yeah, I don't have many non-complex cases. And, I'd love to have some of yours if you're trying to get rid of them. Obviously, I'm joking, but I don't know. Maybe you treat robots. I don't know. So with that definition, that interweaves help facilitate movement when processing is stuck, literally almost anything that we do or say beyond standard protocol counts as an interweave. Anytime we divert even slightly from the protocol. So wow, like what an opportunity for creativity, right? To bring out our own clinical intuition, our natural, unique skills, other work that we've done, other skills we've developed in other modalities, our unique approach, art therapy, music therapy, whatever it is, movement, all of that can come in to interweaves, right? And that feels really great as a therapist to know that we do have a way of putting our unique spin on this modality that can feel very, very rigid at first. As I've said, for many of my clients, interweaves are essential, okay? Not only like maybe this would be helpful, but we have to have them. I have a lot of clients with severe attachment trauma and attachment wounding, and I kind of felt like if I just sat there saying very little, that could be really triggering for them. Just that, right? That staying out of the way could feel very triggering, especially if they're sharing something that nobody else knows, right? They could start wondering what I'm thinking. They could start wondering if they're being impacted by their story at all, if they're blowing it out of proportion because it doesn't seem to impact me. They could just feel very disconnected and not very held by me in the relationship. So for that reason, interweaves feel really important, right? There's that connection that also happens, that really, I'm hearing you, I'm seeing you, I'm noticing where things are tough. It's part of the attachment, part of the relational component. So anyway, an interweave, in so many ways, is basically at the start a question, okay? One question is an interweave. It's you as the clinician. It's like almost like a motivational interviewing role in a sense. Like you're hearing what the client has said, assessing what they might need to hear next, maybe giving a brief summary and a question for them to reflect on. That's kind of a motivational interviewing approach, right? And something for them to reflect on as they move into the next set. There's a great book published in 2022, so it's very recent, called EMDR Therapy, an A to Z Guide to Interweaves by Michelle Morrissey, PhD. And this is exactly what it says, what I was just saying, that it's a question. An interweave is a question. And she gives tons of examples of interweaves, which are questions, essentially just questions, for every possible presenting issue and all the different types of interweaves you might use. So it's a great resource. She's like, interweaves for addiction, interweaves for parenting, interweaves for child abuse, interweaves for, whatever you can think of. So that's a really good resource. And she also has some really nice intro stuff that talks about a lot of the things I'm mentioning here. And so she's got a lot of great stuff to say about interweaves, but I just wanted to quote one little small nugget, which I think is really a beautiful way sort of to think about interweaves. That as therapists, what we're doing, and I quote, she says, what we're doing when we're doing an interweave, right? You as the therapist need to connect the dots between what has happened, meaning like both in the session, in the stuck point, and whatever the client is processing. 2, what they think or believe about themselves. So understanding their negative cognitions really well. 3, what they are experiencing. And I think she means by that, like during the processing. So being attuned to what their experience is. And 4, what neural connections might get activated during phase 3 and 4, end quote. And if we have awareness of that, we'll have a better sense of when we might need to do an interweave. So there's so much amazing stuff that we could unpack from that quote. But a couple of the things I love about it is how well this aligns with the 8-phase protocol and like really honors the importance of phases 1 and 2. It really talks about, if we're doing a really proper history taking, we can access all this stuff she's talking about. We'll have a great place to start for understanding all of these things about clients. I think that the client workbook that I have created and that I use does a pretty good job of this. The intensive workbook that I have clients complete before our first session does a lot of history taking and really frames a lot of these concepts that I quoted from Dr. Morrissey, like gives you a lot of that information up front, and then you can read it over and then discuss it with the client and then like move ahead quickly. If you want to know more about what's in that workbook, check out episode 18 of the podcast. But anyway, this short quotation gives us a sense as therapists about how we can best prepare ourselves and our clients for what we will need in phases 3 and 4. All right, so as I said, I'm going to make this a 2-parter because it's getting a little long. But to finish up, I just want to talk briefly about one of my favorite and most used interweaves. It's a parts work interweave. And if you want to know more generally about parts work, I encourage you to go back and listen to episodes 14, 16, and 17 when I did a little kind of mini series on parts work and how I use it and how I conceptualize it. But in any case, if a client is really stuck, I will ask them the simple question, how old do you feel right now? And then once they've answered that, and they could answer that, they might just say a number. They might talk more about what that number means to them, or they could say, oh, I think I'm in middle school, whatever. And I know that because I'm wearing this outfit in my mind, whatever it is. And once they've answered that, I'll ask, what does that, fill in age part of you need right now? I try not to feed them too much at this point in terms of ideas. And usually clients come up with beautiful answers. Once I had a client and we were processing some grief around the loss of a close person in her life. And we were kind of stuck, right? So I asked her, how old do you feel right now? And the age that she answered was younger than the client was, right? Um, I think she's in her 20s and she was somewhere in her teens, what she answered. Um, and then, you know, and I was sort of like, how do you know that? And she talked about what made her think she was 16, why she was feeling that way. And then I said, okay, what does that 16-year-old part of you need by now? And then she thought about it and she said, I think I need to plant a garden. And I was like, whoa, cool. Like, let's talk about that. And she said, I think I need to plant a garden in that place where I found my dog when he had died. This was not the memory we were processing. Okay, we were processing a loss of a person more recently. But this was allowed us to connect to the fact that we needed to do some work on processing the loss of this pet, because that was clearly connected to how she was experiencing the loss that we were actually, quote, actually processing together. So, you know, and she created this beautiful garden and described it to me, and she cried. I cried a little bit. We talked about the significance of it, and things started to move because we were processing this deeper, more core memory that we hadn't connected with before. It was such a beautiful moment. I hope you get a little bit of a sense of how that interweave might work, and just that, like, asking a simple question can unlock so much. And I do think that parts work often is where I go first. It just tends to really make sense to people and free them up to think creatively, kind of, and have their system feel creative. So, just a quick example there. So, rounding out today, we talked a lot about interweaves, you know, some fears, maybe some misconceptions, how it's presented in basic training, what that can do for how we think about them, little definitions of what interweaves are, how they can be used, and then an example of an interweave I love. I hope this has given you some insight into interweaves, that you maybe feel a little bit less overwhelmed by the concept, a little bit more free to be creative. And next week, I'm going to follow up with some more on how I specifically use interweaves. So I'll be thinking about that this week as I craft next week's episode. So I hope you've learned something of value today, and please tune in next week for more on interweaves. And of course, if you ever want to connect with me, my website is www.futuretemplateparent.com. You can get on my email list, get your free guide to implementing interweaves in your practice. I do consultation for certification. I also do some coaching about getting intensives going in your practice. And I have some exciting announcements about that coming up in a couple of months. So also follow me on Instagram at futuretemplateparent. Thank you so much for spending time with me. I can't wait to connect with you next week. Take care.